This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to our Shmot series, First Principles of Nationhood, where we're exploring what axiomatic ideas sit at the root of Israel's national formation, without which we wouldn't be who we are. How might we adjust our current trends in the Jewish world to realign with these principles? This week's episode has been sponsored by Barbara and Joel Rich in commemoration of the 12th yahrzeit of Leva Bat Yitzchak Meir. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch with us at podcast@matan.org.il or at the Matan office to sponsor some more Shmot episodes. In Parshat Truma, the people are instructed to build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the Parsha details specific items: the aron, the kruvim atop the kaporet, the table and its accoutrements, the menorah, the coverings and curtains, and the bronze altar used for burnt offerings, olah. On one hand, constructing a central place of worship where God dwells and the people meet him is a phenomenon common to so many ancient cultures. But this specific construction contains so many unique dimensions that connect to the particulars of our journey and our unique service of God. Unlike in pagan temples, God does not live in it or eat the sacrifices, but dwells among the people. It's a meeting place of spirits. After wandering for so long without any central anchor, the erection of the Mishkan provides stability for this wandering people, and in it, the people increasingly become co-partners in the venture. During the Exodus, the people transformed their personal homes into sacrificial centers, cooking and eating the Korban Pesach and baking bread, two central elements in tabernacle service. After committing themselves to an eternal covenant, a national home of worship is set up by them. They have become active building partners after several months of passivity. If Har Sinai was the wedding canopy under which we stood with God, the Mishkan is the home we build together to dwell in and deepen our intimacy with God. While once flanked by the cloud and the fire on their way out of Egypt, now the nation encircles the Mishkan, in which the cloud representing God's presence and the fire, now part of the sacrificial process, have been fused into one place. The nation, so to speak, surrounds the presence of God among them. The Mishkan's instructions are delivered in 7 command units, 6 of which deal with creative work, and the 7th which commands the Shabbat. This is one of the many ways the Mishkan text harkens back to the world's creation and suggests that this particular building project was the completion of the creation process. I am so happy to welcome back a returning guest who hasn't been here for a very long time. Dr. Samuel Lebens is an associate professor in the philosophy department at the University of Haifa. He is also an Orthodox rabbi and Jewish educator. He has written books on the nature of propositions, the philosophy of fiction, and the foundational principles of Jewish faith. Among his books are, I think, his latest, Thinking About Stories, an Introduction to Philosophy of Fiction, The Principles of Judaism, and a book meant for the layperson, A Guide to the Jewish Undecided. Professor Sam Lebens, I'm so happy you're here to be with us today.
Thank you, Yosefa. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, it was meant for the layperson. Well, I'll leave it up to the public to decide.
I actually recently handed that book off to my nephew after he started asking me extremely rational questions after Friday night dinner about belief in God. And I was just like, I can go only so far in this conversation, and I think in slightly different channels. No, I think about it in just different language completely. So I was so happy that I had something to offer him. So right now it's in his hands.
I'm very, very pleased.
So it's really great to have you here. And we're going to think a little bit together today about, I think it's very, very safe to say that the Mishkan seems to be some sort of first principle. This idea of having some sort of structure is something that sits at the root of who we are as a people. It'll, of course, take up our biblical imagination and instruction for the entire book of Vayikra and beyond. So I think that, this is really something that is worth diving deep into every year, even though sometimes the details can be overwhelming or can feel repetitive, obviously. And we'll get into the repetition idea maybe in today's episode, maybe in another episode in 2 weeks. But I think that it really behooves us.
The repetitions don't happen this week. They happen
exactly. Right now, it's later. All fresh. It's all fresh. Exactly.
I appreciated the way you described it as there'd been this kind of marriage ceremony at Mount Sinai, and then the Mishkan. You reminded me of a midrash in Shemot Rabbah. Beautiful midrash, one of my favorites, where a mashal is given of a king who has an only daughter, to whom he's very, very attached. And the daughter gets married to a suitor. And the son-in-law says to the king that he'd like to go back to his homeland with his wife, the king's daughter. And the king says, "Well, I I, I can't I can't force you to stay because you're an adult and she's your wife and that's your right. But I also I can't bear to be parted from my only daughter. So do me a favor," he says. "Everywhere you go, make sure that you've built a little room where I can come and stay and visit." And the Midrash says so too. The Torah is God's only daughter, and kind of inverting your reading, of Sefer, which
Yeah.
is quite a natural reading, that the Jewish people married God at Mount Sinai. The rabbis are saying no, the Jewish people married God's daughter at Sinai, God's daughter being the Torah. And the reason God wants to be so close to us, and therefore we have to build this Mishkan, this kind of guest bedroom for God to come and visit us, is not because of his closeness to us, but because of his closeness to his Torah. And of course, that it shifts the way of thinking of God from a heavenly father to a heavenly father-in-law, which is quite a paradigm shift, that God loves us and cherishes us and wants a relationship with us, but only to the extent that we love and cherish and have a relationship with the Torah.
By the way, it's an amazing midrash. I think
Mm,
years ago I had a conversation with Nechama Goldman Barish about that midrash. But as you're saying it now, I'm
mm.
thinking it, and Parshat Yitro, which we read 2 days ago in shul from when we're recording this, is fresh in my mind. I'm thinking about how much that midrash is basically mirror imaging God and Yitro, and that
Oh, that's beautiful. I'd never
right.
thought about that.
I never thought
There's
of
a
it either
father,
until you just
yeah,
described it.
Mamad Sinai is introduced by a father-in-law
Yes,
story.
yes, they must be doing that on purpose. There's no way that
Yeah,
that is not
yeah.
intentional. And then we have, Tzipora, and you also feel also, by the way, the how much
Yeah,
Tzipora
how
is
well
really
has she been
cloistered.
treated? Yeah,
Yeah. Anyways,
yeah,
just fascinating. But yes, that's a great midrash that completely inverts everything we think about our role vis-a-vis
yeah,
God.
yeah,
And it also it's interesting. It's like also this question about like boundaries, like where can Torah
yeah.
enter, where can Torah not enter, where is it appropriate? It's like very much this rabbinic idea again, once we were exiled, that like Torah is something that can be transported all over,
Right,
which is
like the Mishkan and the
right.
Torah both have this portability to them. But um, given your interest in this series on first principles, it also makes me think of that very famous comment of Saja Gaon that the Jewish people are constituted as a people by the Torah. So you may think we have a special relationship with God, and that's what constitutes our nationhood or our national identity. But the Midrash, like Saja Gaon, insists that what makes us unique and what makes us a people is our connection to Torah. If we lose that, we lose what makes us distinctive.
Yeah. I think also I think also because the basic fact is that many people are connected to God, meaning that isn't I don't think that is what's
Exactly.
unique about us.
Well, exactly.
It's a universal connection. It's available to everybody in the world, and it should be.
Yeah.
But the uniqueness
The
of Am Yisrael
Torah
is the
is,
Torah.
as the Midrash in Eicha Rabbah says, if they tell you there's wisdom among the nations, you should believe it. And wisdom doesn't have to be secular. Wisdom can also be a way
Yeah.
of discovering God. But if they say there's Torah among the nations, that's what you can't believe, because the Torah is the unique heritage, the unique inheritance of the Jewish people. Very
Yeah.
much first principle.
Yeah. And I want us to think a little bit about the idea of the Mishkan, meaning what kind of role this kind of project, which, in these parshiot, we're really seeing the blueprint of literally how to make it, how to create it. And it's fascinating that there's so much emphasis on how to go about doing it as opposed to, I don't know, the finished product itself. Or, I mean, that I guess we'll see more when it comes to the Mikdash. But we don't have any pictures of, other than the Chanukkata Mishkan, we don't have any pictures of like on a daily basis how this functioned really within the
Mm.
camp, but there's so much emphasis on how to go about creating it. And I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what kind of role this project has within the nation, or even ask more simply, why so much emphasis on this project?
Yeah, well, there's a whole school of biblical scholarship that really picked off in the early modern period, where there were a number of books published by Protestant thinkers called the Hebrew Republic, more than one book with that title. And the reason for that was they looked at Exodus and Numbers in particular. At They looked at Exodus and Numbers as a kind of paradigm for nation building. And then these Protestant thinkers, a lot of whom influenced the creation of the American state, um, they said, okay, well, if we're going to build a nation, where do we look in the Bible for nation building? Ah, the 40 years in the wilderness was when God took a motley crew of kind of escaped fugitive slaves and forged them into a people. And of course, as we see in the book of Numbers in particular, you've got these 12 tribes. How they're going to be arranged, and they're going to be arranged around the Mishkan, and the Mishkan becomes a central focal point, and that's one of the roles of the Mishkan is to create the notion of a national unifying focal point. I think you see that very clearly in Parshat Truma, in this notion that it's going to be paid for by overwhelmingly by voluntary contributions from the people. Um, I think that you can look at nationhood at two levels. There's a kind of formal level and an informal level. Formally, a nation could be typified by its institutions. So you've got like a government, and you've got an army, and then the government breaks into three branches: the judiciary, the executive, the legislature, whatever it might be. You have these institutions of state, but you also have um, the people, and the people have to be formed into a collective. They need to feel a sense of joint purpose, of joint fraternity. Um, there's a fear that I can't remember which modern political scholar said this. I remember reading it in a book by Will Kimlicker, Canadian political philosopher, that there's a fear that a liberal democracy can devolve, can descend into what they call an interest group plurality. And what they meant by that phrase, an interest group plurality, is everyone's in parliament just to serve their own constituency, and not for the greater good, not for the common good. This is maybe something that people could recognize from politics today, overwhelmingly. Whereas the ideal would be, in my the political culture in which I was raised in Britain, the head of the opposition is called the leader of His Majesty's opposition, or her man. During my lifetime, it was mainly Her Majesty's opposition. The idea was that the opposition is also part of the government, that they're actually there. Both sides, the government and the opposition, are there for the greater good, for the common good. And even though they have disagreements about how to achieve the best for the nation, there's this sense of a common destiny, shared fraternity. And you could think in terms of Rav Soloveitchik's two covenants in Kol Dodi Dofek. The covenant of fate is just people being brought together by the vicissitudes of life, that they share, they face shared threats. Whereas the Brit Ye'ud, the covenant of destiny, is what brings people together when they feel a sense of fraternity, where they feel that they may have disagreements about how to get there, but they feel like they're trying to shape a common future. And that sort of thing, the Brit Ye'ud, it's not easy to build that through legislating. You can't legislate to love one another. You can't legislate to, you could have the best constitution in the world, and yet this threat of an interest group plurality is going to be ever present unless among the people there's a sense of fraternity. And I think one of the things you could learn, and one of the things that the authors of these books, the Hebrew Republic, uh, were conscious of, is the Torah is saying you need to have joint projects. And the building of the Mishkan is par excellence a national project that utilizes different people's skills, different people's. It's largely voluntary, um, um, and I think that's something we could very much learn from today.
Okay, so I actually I want to get to that modern question in a minute, but
Mm.
I want to just take a step back and think about this because of course we have sort of paralleled, we have two projects paralleled, one positive and one negative, right? We have the same principles that are used to create the Mishkan, right? That people are, they have skin in the game. They're giving in their
Mhm.
money, they're giving in their goods,
Their expertise.
their expertise, right? And that's creating something that ultimately we hope to be proud of. We have an inverse of that when it comes to the story of the Egel, right? We have the idea that they also had their skin in the game, like Aaron, whatever his motivations were. And we're not going to go there right now. Is he understood this idea that like they need not only a physical manifestation, quote unquote, of a god, but the people need their skin in the game. They need to feel like they're part of it. So let's have everybody bring their things and everybody be part of this. And we see that like this being part of something, obviously, if it's stewarded towards something that's like ultimately positive, goes in a great direction. And if it's being stewarded towards something that is not where we want society to go, so it can go in a very negative direction and lead very simply to death, meaning it leads very simply to a demise of the society. And I guess again, there's like so many relevant layers to this and what's happening right now that I'm not even sure where to go. But
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 let me relate to this Hegel question. I
yeah.
really like it, and so one of the first thing to be mentioned after the initial commandment to build a Mishkan or whatever is the creation of the Aron, right? The creation of the Ark of the Covenant. And the most striking feature of the Ark of the Covenant is that it has these two giant statues on top of it, these two cherub uh, angels facing one another. And to the uninitiated, and this isn't to cast aspersions upon the uninitiated, but the uninitiated will look at this and say, "Well, hold on a minute. There's an idol in the middle of the middle of the Mishkan. It's two statues facing one another, face to face." Um, I read an article in Tradition by Rabbi Herzl Hefter from years ago that points out that in ancient idol design, there was very often a picture or a relief or a statue of the god, right? The god that they believed in. And the statue would sit on top of animals or other images called the avatar, right? Because each god was supposed to kind of come into the world, be manifest in the world through an avatar. So that would often be represented. Now, if you look through Tanakh in Sefer Malachim and also in Sefer Tehillim, and I think elsewhere, I think in Divrei Yamim, you hear God referred to as he who sits on top of the Kruvim, he who sits on top of the cherubs. So actually, to an ancient eye, if they looked at the Aron HaKodesh, they'd say, "Oh, I see the avatars, but where's the idol? The idol would have been on top of the avatars. The Kruvim are so God who sits upon the Kruvim. There's nothing on top of the Kruvim." Okay, so you want a difference between the national project of Cheta Egel and the national project of the Mishkan. I think that looking at the difference in design between the Aron HaKodesh and the Cheta Egel may give us some meat to get our teeth into here, right? Um, they point to the Egel itself and they say this is the God that took us out of Egypt. So they're thinking of that statue as a representation of, or even a manifestation of something worth worshipping. And therefore, they think that the work of their hands is worth worshipping. And one of the greatest evils of idolatry is that it turns into a narcissism because you start by worshipping the work of your hands and you're very close to basically worshipping just yourself. Whereas the thing that was worshipped in the Mishkan was not any of the things we made. it was the invisible thing that sits on top of that which we made. And I think that's a crucial difference. I also think, and I didn't tell you about this, Yosefa, beforehand, but I really wanted to speak about this.
Go ahead. Surprise me. I love
Yeah.
surprises.
There's a repetition of faces all the way through Parshat Truma. So you've got the Kruvim are facing one another, and then the next thing you make is the tape. And there's the Kruvim on the parochet as well,
The curtain.
the curtain, and then you've also got the lechem apanim, which is sometimes called the showbread. And Rashi explains, and based on the Gemaras, the reason it's called panim is just because it's got it's a strange shape, the bread. So it's got a lot of surface area. So it's got kind of many faces. But I saw in Iturei Torah, which is a lovely collection of kind of little sayings on the Torah, the Ma'ayana Shel Torah quotes in the name of the Gerer Rebbe that there's a miracle about the showbread. The showbread stayed fresh for a whole week and stayed hot for a whole week. And the Ger Rebbe cites a midrash that I can't find. If any of your listeners can find it, I'd love to know. It's not cited properly here, but he cites a midrash where the lechem apanim is like a mirror, and it reflects the face of whoever comes to eat it. So if the Kohen comes with the fire of faith in his heart, then the bread will still be hot and fresh. But if the Kohen comes in a kind of robotic, habitual way, and his religiosity has cooled down, then the bread will be cold and stale. So lechem apanim is this play on the notion of what's inside, because bifnim means one's
Mm.
internality, that's the word, I think, and interiority, that's the word, and panim also meaning faces. The Kodesh Kadoshim, the holiest place in the world, is a place where these two faces are looking at one another, and I think that's also something missing from Chet Egel. Um, um, we can talk about what that difference is, but I think we should sit with it just for a moment. That it's something about an I-thou relationship, not between the people and God, because God isn't physically represented in the Mishkan.
And when Moshe asks him for that relationship, he also tells him no.
Right, that's right. He says,
There's
"You
the
can't see
panim
my
there as
face
well.
and live." Right,
Yeah.
yeah, there's panim there too. You can't see my face and live. Although elsewhere Moshe is described as speaking to God face to face.
Yeah.
But that's a speaking rather than a seeing.
I,
Yeah.
I think when I try and think about and I'm sure there's like such like a wellspring here of like Kabbalistic ideas, but if
So,
I just think about it in slightly more rational terms
yeah.
that are at my grasp, I think very much about how over the years, and I hope no
Mhm.
one's freaked out by me saying this, but over the years, I feel like as if someone observes really carefully over time and listens really carefully, people start to be able to see other people's faces and see what's beneath their face.
Right.
And I think that living in a marriage where two people really see each other truly is a daily exercise in that, right? Of where we can sort of fall short because we take things at their surface level, but really we shouldn't have, and then it probably would have avoided a fight. But like if we're able to see deeper into that, then we can see people for what they are, which is that their face is going to be some sort of representation or reflection. By the way, I was thinking also, it's in the Pshat, but it's also obviously elaborate on in the Midrash about the mirrors that are made, and those mirrors that, the
Right.
Me'orot Tzovot,
You're,
which doesn't use panim, but it's a similar idea that like there's
yes.
something in the Mishkan that is supposed to reflect back to you where you really are. And I think that like if we can't bring that candor to our Avodat Hashem, then
Yeah.
we're really, really at a
Yeah.
loss. Like if you can't bring it in that space where you're supposed to be meeting God, again, whatever that means,
Yeah.
then it's just a show. And we
The
know what a
Egel,
show looks like.
the Egel is all about a show, right? The
Yeah.
Egel is all about appearances, whereas um, if we're thinking of the Mishkan as a national project that is going to bring a people together, one of the things it wants to teach them, even through its architecture, is the importance of seeing the others. being honest with yourself, being able to see your own face and to see the reflection of your face, like you say in the kior, but also to be able to see the face of the other. Because ultimately, from this point onwards, when God speaks to Moshe, he speaks to Moshe from the space between these two kruvim which are facing one another. So it's the space between the I and the thou, between two people really looking at one another, appreciating the other. It's from that space that God speaks. So the architecture of the Mishkan is teaching us that we have to bring that sort of respect for the other, into our lives.
I'm going to pull it back for 1 second to the God space because I want to
Mm,
get back to this piece about the joint project.
mm,
But I think also when I think about the Mishkan, we're talking about and again, as you're saying, as a real, the Egel is an antithesis to this idea
hmm
that we keep trying to say there is corporeality in the world, and we're going to create something that's physical. You're going to give us your jewelry. You're going to give us your
hmm
money. We're going to create these physical objects. But the whole point of creating this physical thing is to be able to bring you much like up close with things you can't see
hmm
and meaning we spoke about this in past episodes how the Mishkan was fairly empty, meaning you had these items there, but that's why it's called makom, meaning there's open
hmm
space. When you don't have that open space, it's very hard to actually meet these things that are not
hmm
visible.
The
Um,
space between.
Exactly. Which, by the way, if I go back to the original piece I said about my nephew and a lot of rational questions about religion, like to me, so much of it, even as both you and I obviously place an emphasis on our rationality in our lives, but there's so much that isn't able to be defined in those
Yeah, that
terms.
transcends.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
and I think that piece about like the physicality of the Mishkan, but that it's supposed to do something else for you. And we see around this so many times, like religious phenomenon where people got stuck in the physical
hmm
process of it, whether it's their really beautiful shul or maybe their nice clothes, or they got really stuck in like the physical aspect and they forgot they needed to go one more level. And I think that the Mishkan kind of is also in this kind of process supposed to remind us of that. And the Egel is exactly what happens, that they get stuck in the physical representation of something that they were looking for, which was, I don't know, leadership or
I mean,
guidance.
I think you're putting your finger on the rabbinic ambivalence towards the Mishkan to to begin with. So read in the order of the Parshat as we're reading them, it's exactly like you said. There's Mount Sinai, and then now you need a Mishkan. Um, but a standard, if not the consensus, but certainly a standard or common view among the rabbis was that the order of the Parshat has been kind of
Tampered
corrupted,
with, meaning it
tampered with
was
by
it was
God, right?
specifically
Not
yeah, it
like
was specifically presented differently.
yeah, and the chronological order was really there was Har Sinai, and then there was Chet Egel, and then there was the commandment to build the Mishkan. So the Mishkan isn't just juxtaposed with the Egel; it's somehow a consequence of Chet Egel. Now, I think there were two factors at play in that rabbinic tradition. One is an ambivalence towards physicality altogether. Like, why do we need objects and why do we need, so it says, well, we didn't really need, but after Cheta Egel, it became clear that we're so weak that we need. Like, ideally, we shouldn't need any physical kind of markers for our faith, any building to contain our worship. But we lusted over our eyes, after our eyes and built a golden calf. So God says, okay, you guys need some razzmatazz. I think there's also um, a small literary element here, which is that after the commandment, after the theophany at Sinai, after the big revelation at Sinai, there's this talk of these two altars, a stone altar and an earthen altar. And the a stone altar is unhewn, and the earth altar seems very, very rudimentary, and we don't hear about them afterwards. So where have they gone,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
And there are different ideas in the Perushim about how no, they really are there in the Mishkan somehow, but to the untrained eye, it just looks like God had an idea about these two types of altar these very, very rudimentary altars, and that's where we were going to worship. And wherever you call out God's name, He's going to be there. Wherever you sacrifice on these types of altars, God's going to be there. And they disappear, and we get the idea of the Mishkan. And the big difference between them and the Mishkan is razzmatazz, right? The Mishkan's all tchelet and argaman and all these beautiful colors and animal skins and precious metals. So so without wanting to resolve what the real chronological order was, there's almost a tension in the text itself between the rudimentary idea of these two altars that are described to us after the theophany at Sinai and the dazzling to the eye Mishkan. But what I've been trying to present today is more the idea of the Mishkan as lechatchila, that the Mishkan was supposed to be built because I see it as a national building project, and that we would have needed with the, whether or not we built an Egel.
It's interesting, this question about the chronology. I don't know what to do with the Mizbeach after Matan
Yeah.
Torah. I think that's it's a real thorn maybe in this theory.
Yeah.
But I've always really looked at the I would say insertion in air quotes of Chet Egel in the middle of the Mishkan instructions, very similar to the way that the story of Yehuda and Tamar is clearly inserted in Perek Lamed Chet and Breshit, meaning there's also there's a very clear sign of resumptive repetition, which is the phrase that's used. You have the commandment of Shabbat at the end of the first section of as I said in the introduction, and then you have the Mishkan, and then you have Chet Egel, and then the next section about Mishkan begins with Shabbat again. And so it's the text is very aware that it has interrupted itself with a story,
Right.
and
because you've got Mishkan, Egel, Mishkan.
the Torah has to reconnect you back to the previous story,
Right.
So I think that
it has a literary feeling of an insertion, is what you're saying.
completely, and I think that it really supports the idea, meaning if this is not the chronological space of the Egel story, which I agree it's likely not. The question is why have it here? And I think it's because exactly the point you said. If the story of the Egel would have come first, then we would have said the Mishkan is all b'diavad. But the Torah Dafka doesn't want us to come to that conclusion. It wants us to say, no, there's an element that was meant to be always, and there's an element that's also needed. Here you see a story of human failing.
That's actually how I understand Rashi's position. I understand Rashi's position as there would have been some sort of Mishkan. It's just it might not have looked exactly as it does had it not been for the Egel, but there'd have been something. And maybe, by the way, that's the thorn. It's no longer a thorn. It would have looked more like the two rudimentary altars, but it would have been something.
And can I just ask you a question though, Sam, about the building projects? Because if I'm thinking a little bit also just about how we take this with us, in the times that we're in, and this idea of having a national project. So, I mean, I guess we can call that the State of Israel, though I'm not really sure. I'm just curious how you see this manifest, or you would like to see it manifest in the world today. I mean, it's like a very general question. You could take it as big or small as you want.
I remember in 2012 in London when we hosted the Olympics, and Gabby and I, my wife and I think we all already lived in Israel at that time. Yeah, we definitely did. But we came back to visit our folks, and we went to the Olympics. And Britain is a country that doesn't tend to show its pride in itself very often. It's got lots of pomp and circumstance. So from the outside, you'd think it does. But as I heard a British comedian say recently, Americans go like USA, USA, and a British person kind of just tuts, we don't, we around the king and the queen, we show lots of pomp and ceremony, but we don't like to actually admit in person to having deep emotions about anything, let alone, our patriotism.
Which, by the way, is a sidebar, which is why I think that British television and movie and comedy is of the
Yeah.
best in the Western world because somehow people seem to just get it all out there because they don't get it out in their daily
They have to
affects.
get it out
They
there.
don't get it out in their daily affects, but there is really, I mean, really, it is the thing that I will, if I ever watch anything, it's going to be something British. It's
Yeah, yeah,
definitely not going to be something
they
American.
punch above their weight as a small, as a relatively small
Mamash.
country.
Yeah.
But there was such pride, like on open display, and a lot of it came from the fact that there were these masses of volunteers who were there to help tourists find their place, to help, to work as ushers the whole thing was held up by a spirit of volunteerism. In the Jewish world, again, Anglo Jewry. I love it. I came from it, but in many ways, it's like 50 years behind American and Israeli Jewry in terms of, its attitudes to various things, whether it's attitudes to women, attitudes to in halachic practice, in various ways. It's just behind. And yet, Anglo Jewry created something astonishing in Limud, right?
Mm.
And Limud UK, once a year, throughout what is the Christmas break, basically, thousands of people come together to learn, but the entire thing it is held up by volunteers, right? There's a very small professional staff, and the people who actually tachlis organize the entire event are just an army of volunteers. And I think, there's lahavdil between Limud and the Olympics because the Olympics at the end of the day is just about sports and physical achievement, whereas Limud is really about learning Torah, hopefully. Um, a notion of volunteerism. I think we saw this in the war, and we continue to see it, but especially at the outset of the war, um, a number of people went to fight because they're trained and they're the Miluimnikim and the whatever. But the rest of civil society stood up and was like, "What can we do to help? How can we help?" Um, Sadly, the fissures that divide Am Yisrael right now are very potent and very salient. So it might not be possible to create a national volunteering network or a project that the entire Am Yisrael can feel that they really connect to. But you can start more small. You can start just in your local community or in your city or in your neighborhood. Um, Building things through the power of volunteerism, where people give of their time, their money, their expertise, just like they did to build a Mishkan. Um, and I think that the more a spirit of volunteerism um, um, spreads across a nation, the more likely they are to, like you did him in this country. Isn't that a lovely thing? Like,
Yeah. Having car trouble.
yeah, you're having car trouble. You just call you did it, which is just a network of volunteers.
Yeah.
Um, those things play a role that are similar to the role that the Mishkan played, or the building project of the Mishkan played in the history of Am Yisrael. And I think that a nation without such projects is just much less healthy and at much greater risk of descending into what I heard was called an interest group plurality. And we see that before our eyes. Um, there are fissures, and there is a sense that the people in the Knesset certainly are there to protect just their constituency and not thinking about the greater good at all. I won't mention the party because I don't want to get party political, but there was a party in their local elections in Israel. In Netanya, their slogan was "Vote for us, get more." And you're like, what? Like, what about JFK's don't ask what you can do, what the country can do for you. Ask what you can do for the country. We're a long way from that. But on the other hand, you've got your Didim, you've got Yad Sarah, you've got all sorts of amazing voluntary associations. And if we can lean into a volunteering spirit, I think we can create wider and wider associations. And I think also a big difference between Limud and the Olympics, remember, is the difference between the Chet HaEgel and the building of the Mishkan. Is at the end of the day, it's not fair to say
Well,
that.
have deal. Goodness, as an athlete, I have to
Yeah,
say there's a lot of
yeah.
spirit in
There's a
athleticism.
lot of, and there's sportsmanship, and
Yeah,
lots of great things.
yeah,
But at the end of the day, are you worshipping the the work of your hands,
yeah.
or are you all getting together for something that's greater than you? And if you're all getting together and volunteering for something that's greater than you, then then I think that's a recipe for the creation of a strong society.
I'll just add one piece, which is that the question of volunteerism versus obligation is an
Mm,
interesting one. And that, one could look at the whole enterprise of Shirut Leumi, which many of the religious women, let's say, opting
yeah,
out of
yeah,
army, look at it as an obligation, meaning they don't
yeah,
look at it, but in its creation, it's voluntary, meaning once you've
yes,
opted out of army, you do not have to then sign up for Shirut Leumi.
yeah,
And therefore, one could look at all, the, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands, maybe much less, I'm not sure what the numbers are, of young women and men who are doing Shirut Leumi is also sort of part of like a volunteer force in the country. And there are many people, I definitely, have been listening very closely among, American political scenes, and I'm not
mm,
exactly sure about England, but where they've really said that we really need to bring in some sort of service
yeah,
model into this
yeah,
country. And it's for the exact same reason. And I think that even though the army is obligatory,
mhm.
there's a certain degree of choice, right, within
Yeah,
what
but
you're putting
how do
yourself
you
in.
serve? Yeah,
How do you serve? And I think that ultimately the army is, with all obviously of the flaws, on a
mm.
societal level, it creates many of those niches of redemption, I think,
No,
or
I
of
absolutely
of
agree.
tikkun that society needs as well.
And as someone who teaches in a multicultural university where, I have a good number of Arab students and some of my Arab students serve, the Druze students, for example, they
Hmm.
serve in the army, but many of my Arab students, for various reasons, don't serve, and not obligated to serve. And I often think that they miss out. Not, I understand why they might not serve in the army, but to do Sheret Lumi, where you volunteer in your local schools, or you volunteer for the fire service locally, or you volunteer for because you're going to start to value your society that much more if you feel that you've really given something of yourself to create it and to uphold it. And surely that's part of what we learn from the Mishkan. And I think it's interesting to think about those elements of the building of the Mishkan which were voluntary, and those elements which were compulsory. Everybody had to give the machatzit shekel, right? And so there are taxes for the building and the maintenance of the Mishkan that are compulsory, but there are also the voluntary donations. So that's an interesting part of the model you mentioned, Yosef, that for those young, often men going off to the army, it's obligatory that they serve in the army, but how they serve is largely up to them.
I'll also just say that I know from the stats and also very much personal experience that most of the men who have been motivated to continue going back to Miluim in this past year
Mm,
and a half will all say that they're doing it for the men they serve with, meaning they
yeah,
would never leave them
automatic.
alone, meaning they don't,
Yeah,
aren't showing up because, oh, Medinat Israel called me, meaning that's,
yeah,
of course, a truth. And
yeah,
it's really a very salient piece that's come through is the camaraderie and the loyalty
right.
that the men and women feel toward one another. And I think that
Comes
also
back
very
to
much
the face-to-face
exactly,
notion of the Mishkan.
exactly
Right.
of seeing each other and being there for each other,
That's right.
and those notions that are non-visible notions, the
Right.
loyalty and camaraderie, which is what it binds people together, even though you can't see them.
And as a literary feature, it's almost get the sense. I know it's difficult to read some of these Parshiot because they're very detailed and there's the repetition. There's also kind of a beauty that each each skill set is utilized to make something else, and then only at the end they're all kind of put together, right? And there's that notion that we start to appreciate the other much greater, much more after we've given of ourselves and they've given of themselves. And then you see, wow, these things come together to create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. I think that the story is told in such a way to make you feel that kind of excitement.
Yeah. I mean, I think that even just on a family level, as you just described that, I think about like my house on an Erev Shabbat. I have one kid who's
Yeah,
making the dessert and one kid who's sitting at the table, and my
exactly.
husband's cooking, and I'm, I don't know, cleaning, cooking, or feeding children. And there's like this symphony, usually
And
chaotic, but there's some sort of,
but still, and Shabbat comes out of it.
yeah, and then that's what comes out of it.
Yeah,
But Sam, we're going to have to wind down in not
sure.
so long, but I really wanted us to touch upon one more point in our conversation, and that's the point about the idea of tzimtzum, which
Gosh.
many what?
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah, it's a small
Just a
a
small
small
little.
item. Yeah, it's really because if we go back to the things we can see, the things we can see, and the idea also of I think, I mean, it's also something that of course will be radically different from the Egel, right? It's the exact opposite of the corporeality
Mm.
and the imminence, right, of an idol or something of that sort. I kind of wanted to think that out with you a little bit because when we had spoken and you really said to me that, I mean, people might know this idea from Kabbalah, but we really need not only know this idea from the world of Kabbalah. So why don't you just take us into that for a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So Tzimtzum, as it's come down to us, is like one of the key doctrines of Lurianic Kabbalah from Yitzhak Luria, and um, that notion is supposed to explain some sort of puzzle. The puzzle is that in some sense or other, and I can't spell this out here because it's really complicated, but in some sense or other, God is too big, is too great, is too perfect, too expansive for there to be room for anything other than God. And therefore, there's a puzzle. How did God create a universe? And Tzimtzum is supposed to be the answer to that, that God somehow contracts himself in order to create space for a universe. Already I have done tremendous violence to the tradition because there's so much more, it's so much more complicated than that. And there are various machlokot about how various disputes about how to understand the problem and how to understand the solution, but that's enough for our purposes. But the Ramban, Nachmanides uses the word Tzimtzum to describe what goes on to God's presence in the Mishkan. And although you don't really see it until Parshat Pekudei, right at the end of Shemot, where Moshe literally can't enter the
Mm-hmm.
Mishkan because it's
Because the cloud is
filled.
taking up all the space.
Right, the cloud and the glory of God, and it talks about these two things, the cloud and the glory, and are they the same? Are they two names for the same thing? Are they slightly different things? It reminds us of the fire and the cloud at the top of the mountain in Har Sinai. Moshe can seem to enter one; he enters the cloud, but he doesn't enter the fire. Um, how do we relate to God's relationship to space? Does God take up space? Does, Yitzhak Luria, on at least a flat-footed reading of the problem, makes it sound like God fills all space in such a way there's no room for anything else, right? And that certainly seems to be what takes place in the Mishkan. But as you noted, as in your beautiful introduction, Yosefa, where you say that a difference between the Mishkan and kind of other ancient temples is in ancient temples the building was the home of God, whereas it's very much presented in Parshat Truma that building the Mishkan will enable God to dwell among the Israelites, not necessarily in the Mishkan, right? He says, I'm gonna dwell amongst you," and of course the Midrashim and the Hasidic tradition in particular really lean into this, which is that once we build the Mishkan, God dwells in our hearts. There's that famous line of the Kotzker Rebbe, where does God live? Wherever you let him in, so to speak. Um, but I do think I want this is really Parshat Kudei, but it's not too far away from Parshat Truma, so I'll share it with
Okay,
you
I
anyway.
let you. I let you.
Okay, there's an amazing midrash, uh, mind-boggling midrash, right? If you look at the end of Sefer Shmot, Moshe can't enter the Mishkan because God's filled it up. right? Um, but at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, at least on one way of reading it, and this is the way that the rabbis read it, God's inviting Moshe in. So all of a sudden he can go in, right? He couldn't go in and now he can go in. What's going on? And the Midrash suggests the following. Says, imagine a king who commissioned a palace to be built. And when he came into the palace, he saw that the architect had written on every object the name of the king. And the king was so moved by this act of devotion to him that he said, how can I stay inside here and not invite the architect in? Architect, come in. In the Nimshal, says God looked at the Parshiot, especially in Parshat Pekudei, of the building of the Mishkan, and he saw that after every vessel, Moshe wrote, Moshe did as commanded by God. Kashet Tziva Hashem. And yet God hadn't told him to write that. So this is like remarkably controversial midrash. What, Moshe's putting things in. There's a Gemara in Sanhedrin that says, no, in Baba Batra, that says if you think Moshe put anything in the Torah of his own accord, then you're a heretic. But this midrash is saying Moshe put in the words as God commanded Moshe, right? And he did it all the time. And God was so moved by this act of dedication that he said, how can I sit in the Mishkan all alone? Let's invite Moshe in. Now, the problem with heresy is easily got over because even if Moshe did put words in on his own accord, if God approved of those words, then they're appropriated and then they get in. That's fine. What the Midrash, I think, is really talking about is how do two people make room for one another, right? Moshe wants to take initiative in the building of the Mishkan, according to this Midrash. But how do you take initiative when you've been given a litany of very, very precise laws about exactly how to build the Mishkan? So the one piece of initiative he does is in his writing of the story in the Torah. He writes that he did everything as he was told to, except the irony is he wasn't told to write that he'd done everything as he was told to. So in his active initiative, he also shows a tremendous amount of humility. And this creates room, so to speak, for God. The Gemara in Sota and elsewhere, I can't remember off the top of my head where else, but there's a few places where the metaphor is brought of arrogance being toxic to the presence of God, because if you're arrogant, there's no room in your heart for anybody other than you. So there's this notion that building the Mishkan is a national process of trying to make room for God. And I think we've spoken a little bit about how that's done, because the architecture of the Mishkan is all about making room for the other. The distance between yourself and the reflection in the kior, the face-to-face of the kruvim, the lechem hapanim, which somehow alludes to both the exterior of a face and the interior of what's inside a person. Somehow, if God had to contract himself in order to make room for us, the world, somehow we have to contract ourselves to make room for the other, and ultimately the ultimate other, which is God. So that's my little drosha on
Tzimtzum on
Tzimtzum.
al regel echad. Wait, so two thoughts I had in response to that. The first is just as I was sort of thinking about this idea, I came across a fascinating book by Rav Yaakov Emden, which was called, I think, Mitpachat Sfarim. It's a very interesting name. And it basically was a book where he was basically trying to say that one need not look at the Zohar as an authoritative work. Okay, this was a very obviously controversial work of Rav Yaakov Emden.
He did a lot of textual analysis to try and figure out how old it was.
Yes. So one of the things he writes about there is that he says, the idea of tzimtzum should be a basis. It's an ikar emunah. It's a pillar of faith. He said you don't need Kabbalah to come to that idea. He said, the world had been created. if not for Tzimtzum. He said it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
you don't need the Lurianic idea, which is also more about the vessels and then the breaking of them, and then
yeah.
God exists in all these
There's a
different kind of
basic
spaces.
philosophical problem, which is how does God
Yeah,
coexist with a world? Yeah.
exactly. And he says you don't need again, he was looking to make space between him and Kabbalah, right? So he was saying you don't need that principle really to come to
Hmm.
that same conclusion. There, as you said, there's so many different levels of the way the idea of Tzimtzum is reflected in all different Hasidic spaces. Meaning, some of them
Yeah.
say the world is, the more of a Chabad idea is the concept that the world is simply an illusion. Meaning, the what you
Hmm.
think the world is really just actually a smokescreen, which is a very
Hmm.
different version than the others that are put forward. So
Absolutely.
there's so many levels in this. The midrash you brought about Moshe taking initiative within all those instructions is
Mm-hmm.
also, and I haven't seen the midrash inside, so I don't know if I could prove this language wise. But of course, it's such a salient metaphor when it comes to halachic living, right? Meaning the question
Yes.
of how does one live a life with some degree of individual expression, which Chazal knew always that we needed that degree, which is
Sure.
why
They
you have
celebrate that.
kimu v'kiblu. We had to accept the Torah on our own. Meaning
Hmm.
there's so many rabbinic texts that speak to the idea of autonomy. It's not just
Mm.
one collective, a socialist project, and that I think that really sits at the root of that question as well. Like, how do you, in your obedience, create your own mark or find your space in that obedience? And I think that whether it's that very direction oriented, I did this as I was supposed to, and that's like me wearing, not me meaning like the firm guy wearing his funky socks, right? Meaning finding those
Finding room.
spaces, finding the
Yeah.
room for yourself. And as you said so beautifully, ultimately it's this exercise. If we stopped at finding room for ourselves, then we would really fall short of what this
Right.
project is
You
going for.
also have to find room for others. But what's so beautiful about this midrash is it says, you know what the most distinctive thing about Moshe was? It was his humility. Even as he's taking initiative, he's somehow
His
manifesting his
obedience.
humility. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, his obedience is. If people are interested in that more Chabad take where the world is merely an illusion and that's how God makes room for the world, in sense he doesn't.
Yeah.
Um, I have a paper that's it's very imperfect. I wrote it a long time ago, so I hope people will forgive me for its imperfections. But it's called God and His Imaginary Friends, and I think it's open access, so people should be able to find that online. But um, if you're interested in omnipresence, like God is everywhere, there's a project that needs to be done in our reading of Tanakh. Um, Nothing is hidden from God. He makes that clear in various psukim throughout Tanakh. Nothing's hidden from God. So some people think that all it means for God to be omnipresent, for God to be everywhere, is that he knows what's going on everywhere and his power extends to every region. That much the God of the Bible definitely seems to have just on the surface. Nothing's hidden from him, and his power extends to every region, to every part of space. So if that's all it means to be omnipresent, then God is omnipresent. But the Tanakh also presents this notion of God's kind of concentrated presence, like in the snare, in the burning bush, and in the Mishkan, in the Kodesh Kodashim in particular, when the
Yeah, there could
cloud
be
comes
more of
down.
God in one space than another. Like it's not
That's
all
right.
evenly spread out.
That's right. But I mean, how to make sense of that is very peculiar because, God doesn't have parts and he's infinite. So to say that there's more in one place than another, but that's certainly how it's presented, a more concentrated presence. And the question is, you know, where do you find this concentrated presence? How do you generate it? Part of the Mishkan is suggesting that if you abide by all of these halachot and you keep every single iota of the law, then somehow you'll have made space for God to enter. You build me this Mishkan, and then I'm going to dwell in your hearts. So there is a thing so that's why I think it's not just Parshat Pekudei. It's right there, right in the beginning in Parshat Truma. It's it's this dance in which by taking a step back through observing a law that has been imposed upon us from without, taking a step back by observing God's law, we create, pardon me, we create a space for God to enter. And I think that dynamic, like you said, you don't need the Zohar or Rav Yitzchak Luria to teach us about some of the basic Kabbalistic concepts. I think that dynamic is there in Parshat Truma. You keep these laws, I'll live among you. If you don't, I won't. Well, why not? Well, because the threat is you won't have taken a step back, and therefore you'll have left no room. And that's why Cheta Egel perhaps is so bad. It's entirely of the initiative of the people, and it descends into self-worship.
Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens, really a pleasure to have you on. This is just sort
Steph,
of like
it's always a pleasure to
a
talk to
rolling
you.
chevrutah, and
Yeah,
it's the
I
best
look forward
kind of
to
way to
next
start
time.
the day. So thank you so much. And
Thank you. My great
yeah, I'm
pleasure.
sure that there's so much to think about and reflect on. And I just want to say here also, I love when when people reach out and they share thoughts. And so really, please feel free to reach out to me, podcast@matan.org.il. It's a total pleasure. And yeah, everybody have a Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.